Hello and welcome to Woman Up, the podcast series by Desperate Art Wives. Woman Up is a podcast talking to women artists, creatives, art critics, feminist historians, activists and more. The series was conceived by Desperate Art Wives founder Amy Dignam in collaboration with me, Susan Merrick. Desperate Art Wives is a platform established in 2010 for women artists who are also mothers and carers. Amy's work focuses on domestic disorder, unsteady identity, power and dysfunction. And I'm an artist interested in feminism, language, power and access. In this platform, we share conversations with women that inspire us and our work, whilst producing a long-form content of resources for other people to access. Hello and welcome to Woman Up, the podcast series by Desperate Art Wives. I'm Susan Merrick and today I'm talking to legendary artist Bobby Baker. Bobby recently performed at the South Bank Centre for the WOW Festival for the second time, with her revived seminal work from 1988, Drawing on a Mother's Experience, the new work called Drawing on a Grandmother's Experience. A dedicated feminist, this work and much of Bobby's multidisciplinary career reflects the hidden reality of a female artist, considering domestic life and undervalued roles. Hello and welcome, Bobby.
Hello. Hi, it's really nice to be here. We've had a slight tech issue connecting, so I'm very, very excited and pleased that I've managed to overcome the technicalities at the age of 69. Ta-da!
I'm very pleased that we managed to overcome them as well. You've been very patient with me, thank you. To put into context where we are at the moment, it's currently the April the 21st, 2020, so Bobby and I and the rest of the country in the UK are still under lockdown. That context may be useful depending on what we end up talking about.
Well, it's very, very useful in relation to tech stuff because I'm completely on my own with just a dog and a cat and nobody to turn to help with technical issues, which is why I feel so particularly triumphant that I've done it.
Yeah. Well, it kind of leads me on to the first question I've got, Bobby, is quite an informal one. I had a nosy on the internet and found an interview that you did in Madrid last year.
Oh, great, yeah.
Yeah, it was a great interview. Within that, you talked, so I said I'd start informally. You talked about loving family life, day-to-day life, watching TV, eating meals, cooking, that kind of thing. And considering we're currently in lockdown, I wanted to know what your favourite thing to do at home is.
Oh dear, I like it all so very much. I mean, the only thing I don't like is not being able to sort of see people, be a bit more connected. But I've kind of find myself, I've always been absolutely fascinated by everyday life and daily life, and I can't get bored of a domestic detail or more because it's the kind of stuff that my work's always been about. So I enjoy that. I moved to Wood Green 3 or so years ago, and so in a way, being here has meant I've had to stay here. I can't dash about quite so much, but I like doing pretty well everything all the time all together. So I like having the telly on. I like having the cooking. I like randomly doing a bit of this and a bit of that. What I find really difficult is just sitting doing one thing all the time, even with drawing. I never would just draw. I've always got to have other things going on, like the telly or the radio. At the moment, I'm just addicted to the television and I record a lot of things. So I like having that going in the background. I really love cooking and I belong to the Slimming World group and we meet in Zoom. Some people are in their cars to get privacy from their small children and talk about cooking. And I'm losing weight because I'm just really focusing on on this kind of passion for food and cooking. I like gardening, and I like working. And so it all muddles in, and there's nobody to sort of be annoyed that I'm sort of working in the middle of the night, because I keep going to sleep at different times. And I've got grandchildren and I've got people to connect with at certain times of the day, but there's something incredibly liberating about it. So yeah, I do like an awful lot of it, apart from the anguish of it all. And I really am enjoying connecting with people in slightly more informal ways via Zoom or whereby or whatever. Although that's very tiring.
Well, it's very refreshing actually to hear you talk about not doing one thing at a time, because I'm exactly like that, and I think I always berate myself about it. I'm not sure why. I feel like it's supposed to be focused, but I focus by doing lots of things, I think.
Well, I really feel quite strongly now as I get older about being a bit more assertive about that, because I think if you grow up in a particular culture where there is one way of operating, that you learn like this and you pass exams, and if you're a woman, you can only do so well. And I kind of think I've come to understand much more the way my mind works, which is really flitting about, and one thing sparks off another. And I do like really concentrated periods of doing things, but I find that I've had most of my better ideas or best ideas when I'm driving or doing something else. They don't just, I hugely admire writers who just sit and write a story. I could never do that.
Mm.
And because so many things are weirdly interconnected, you have an idea about this and then don't know how to resolve it creatively. So the sort of wandering around seems to then allow you a bit of chance for your brain to sort of fizzle along. So yeah, I'm quite strongly think having a way that you work yourself is something to be stuck up for, and not just accepting the norm of this sort of super rational. Where did that come from, rationalism? I'm a bit sort of gadfly-like about academic things, but I really like intellectual ideas, and then I can never explain where I heard it from. But it's like that whole thing about the rise of rationalism, whenever that was, that was sort of controlling, very, it strikes me as particularly patriarchal way of this is sense, and I believe that we can never understand anything. It's never straightforward. It's always interconnected. Everything is so incredibly complicated that very, very few people would ever understand the whole of it, and they wouldn't even aspire to. It's like, so that's why having a way of being where you're dotting from one thing to another is perfectly fine. That's what I think.
Do you think, Bobby? So I haven't seen your fantastic performance live. I've only been able to see bits on recorded on video, and at Larder I saw the older work. But Amy went to see your performance at the South Bank. She absolutely loved it.
Okay.
Do you think that way of working that you've described, kind of flitting between, plays a part in that kind of? I'm
performing a version of me, and I'm doing it in a very knowing way, to kind of allude to my age. So it's sort of playing with what you would expect somebody like a woman. When I was a younger woman performing that show for the first time, I was taking the piss out of myself. I mean, I use what I know about myself, which is a white middle class woman. And then I think people relate to it in a hugely different set of ways, depending on what their age, what their gender, what their experience of life is. So that's why I think I'm very, very conscious of what I'm doing during the performance, and I'm sort of reading the audience. And I'm not making it's a sort of connection where if you have one audience, you behave in one way, and if you had another audience, you behave in another way. So I think I think everybody reacts to it in a slightly different way.
Well, that's right. And Amy and I actually responded really differently to an older piece of yours called Pull Yourself Together.
Oh, right.
Where, and again, we both saw it from completely different angles. She saw it and loved it and actually enjoyed the idea from her own personal life story, thinking, do you know what, sometimes I need to be told pull myself together, so I did. And I saw it very much from the ridicule of, this is what we are told, pull yourself together, and it is a ridiculous thing to be shouted at and told. So we kind of had very different views on
that is absolutely fascinating, because I mean, I'm completely taking the piss out of it, having been told, my mother, poor mother, telling her, you know, sort of screaming down the phone at me when I had this major breakdown. Pull yourself together, and then I must pull myself together. It's this kind of way. So I'm not saying that we should all run around sort of like headless chickens, displaying our emotions at all. But I really think when you make a piece of work, it absolutely is everybody's right to react the way it relates to their experience. And because I've talked to a lot of people and a lot of feedback, I really am, I never forget my father-in-law when I was young doing Drawing on a Mother's Experience at the first time. He was quite an intellectual man. I mean, a deeply profound patriarch, sort of chauvinist, utterly lacking in insight, but a really good, sweet man of his generation. And I asked him to read a Griselda Pollock piece about something, and he went, well, she's his feminist tract where I just see good, clean fun. It's really funny. But I was really glad that he liked the show and saw it in the way, I really want people to react to the work. It's got to be, the biggest thing. It's about communication. It's about being accessible. And so, it is entirely people's right to hate it or love it or to read one thing into it or something else. So, you and Amy should have separate, different opinions. And the only thing I find difficult is when somebody is very categorical about this is what it means. Because you are speaking for yourself, really.
In the show, so the first iteration was the experiences of being a mother, and you've now added in the experience of being a grandmother. I wanted to ask, because you often in your work refer to or reflect on the domestic and the lack of value that has. So I wanted to ask about the status of mother compared to grandmother, and whether you deal with that in the work and how you see that status, I guess, that value.
That's a really interesting question, actually. I mean, I would say my entire career, since I kind of really felt that I was an artist in my early 20s, when I discovered making, I went to St. Martin's and I did painting, and I just couldn't relate to what was going on there. I mean, I had quite good time socially and I painted quite a bit, but it was a very, it was in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. I was just a middle-class girl who was meant to marry somebody and have their children, an art teacher probably. But in my head, I wasn't that, but I didn't know what to do. So I sort of gave up art because I couldn't see how I could ever fit into the sort of work that was being made. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. But then I had this sort of revelation where I made a really bad cake one night living in this squat, which was a baseball boot. And because I'd been to St. Martin's, which had the British School of Sculpture, Caro and his followers, and it's very, very macho acting out these huge metal girders with Greek names and things. And I just looked at this baseball boot one night and decided this badly made cake, and decided it was a work of art of great significance. And it was so utterly subversive and this abject, pathetic little thing that I would go in St. Martin and say, here's a work of great significance. But that is what I really thought. It was like a light bulb going off in my head. I could make what I wanted. So I started making work out of food and then cake. And then I met these people who described themselves as performance artists and joined with them. So and from that moment on, I felt I was an artist. But what I wanted to make work about was what I was really interested in. And I remember having this bit of a tussle thinking, well, is it relevant to anyone else? And I thought, well, that doesn't matter because I'm making it for me, really. And if they are interested, that's an added bonus. But it's got to be kind of have integrity and be authentic. And I think what has emerged over the years is this kind of conviction that if I make something about my life, I'm not saying it's not autobiographical in the sense it's using myself to illustrate a set of complicated ideas about everyday life and domesticity, which is quite a political take on it. But I don't want people to think about me. I want them to think about their relation to that subject, to leave talking about their own lives or their own family history or their mothers or themselves as mothers. And so when I was in my 20s, I had my first child when I was 30. During my 20s, when I was making work, it was about cooking, or it was about, it was about everyday life. It was a sort of mostly sort of involved sugar, actually. But then when I started making work as a young mother, what still shocked me massively that it has no status, that role has no status. And although I understand it a great deal better, it's still, this was 1980 and where are we now? It's still, being a parent generally is not something that's considered a value, and daily, domestic skill is not counted in a way. And wonderful Sandy Toksvig in this Adam Smith Memorial Lecture, which I discovered online, and I sort of wanted to run around the house going, hooray.
I haven't seen that. I'll have to look for that.
Well, it's online. I'm not the whole thing, but she's Chancellor of St Andrews University, and they asked her to give the Adam Smith Memorial lecture, and he's economist. So she coined this phrase, grossly undervalued domestic product, and speaks so eloquently, and that absolutely, that is the underpinning of what I believe, that what goes on, and it's very, very pertinent now with, the COVID-19 crisis, that it's the carers, it's the people who are doing the everyday work, and this domestic labour that's going on for us all, but especially for people with families and children. And because things have changed to a degree that men are already much more involved, younger parents, fathers are more involved. It's not entirely equal because we live in the society we do, but that you can't escape how important it is. And if you don't consider it economically, the Wages for Housework campaign, and if you go back to the suffragettes, it was the middle class version of the movement that sort of overcame the more working class one. So domestic labour wasn't, you had to work like a man in order to get status.
Yeah.
And the Wages for Housework campaign, lost out to another version of feminism in the 70s, wasn't it? Or the late 60s. But I believe if you don't look at the whole thing about labour, whether it's emotional or physical, then, I've gone on a bit of a roll, but I feel so strongly about it. So as a grandparent, that was my experience as a mother. But as a grandparent, it's really good actually in lots of ways, because you don't have the labour. You don't have a lot of well, you could do if you're looking after the children every day, but you have more status as a grandparent. And grandmothers, even in our Western, Northern society, do have a degree of status. And I love being a grandmother. So it's a bit more cushy, really, being a grandparent. And you don't have to deal with all the running around in quite the same way.
Excellent. You so within that, you touched on how you started using food, but myself and Amy actually, I'm really interested in terms of the performance side of it, how it became so intrinsic. I mean, assume through the domestic interest that you have. Amy was really interested because she uses food herself, attributes it to life events in her personal and artistic life. She's Italian, so she has a lot of cooks. So food is very important to her as well. But both of us would like to know a bit more about how this strong connection with food in your work, I suppose, began after the cake and or continued after it.
Well, I think it happened before. I think I've always been very interested in a really nosy child, and my mum was really complicated, not the easiest parent to be with, but from many ways, but incredibly clever when, I look back on it, but kind of stuck doing housework. And I think I probably only felt really close and cared for by her when she was feeding us or looking after us when we were ill. And I think I've just always had this thing about cooking. So my dad died rather tragically when I was 15 on a family holiday. He was drowned, and I was the youngest, so I was left living with my mum. And it was a really pretty tortuous relationship, or she was very troubled for quite a long time. But the one thing she could do, she was completely immersed in her own life and not remotely emotionally caring of anybody else, but she really was great with food. I remember she used to go to Marks and Spencer's in Bromley and come back and say, I've got us 2 really lovely pears for supper. And these, really mattered that she was able to show her love and affection through that. And so I suppose I was interested, and then I got, that whole 60s thing about cooking. I got really keen on cooking and Elizabeth David for a while. I've never really bothered to do it thoroughly, but when I was at St Martin's and becoming increasingly disaffected with the art world as I saw it, I had to write a dissertation, and what was it called? It's really great. The culture. It was, I can't remember what it was called, the academic bit of the course, which wasn't, it could be academic, but I had a great tutor, and I said I wanted to write my dissertation on how to make chocolate mousse. And she really entertained it. It's just there's something so exquisitely beautiful about this Elizabeth David recipe for making chocolate mousse. And I couldn't quite pull it, so I wrote something quite complicated about food for my dissertation, and about sort of, it was a Virginia Woolf dinner party from the Lighthouse, and there was a bit of Levi Strauss and there's a bit of James Joyce. It was all very kind of round the houses stuff, but it was trying to get to grips with that subject. But I think, I'm just really interested in it. And what I loved when I started making this edible food was that I didn't have to lug it around and it vanished. People ate it and then absorbed it or excreted it. It was like this very, very complicated way of relating to a work of art that I found more interesting, although I love painting and drawing very much. And then just one thing led to another, really. I I got really into initially making things out of sugar, but I got really fed up with sugar, partly because I ruined my teeth by doing so much sugar work. I did the history of modern art out of sugar. My teeth have never been the same since. And I made a sort of sugar supermarket, and I made a whole life-size family out of cake called An Edible Family in a Mobile Home. And then I kind of got into the big breakthrough was doing this show called Packed Lunch at the Hayward Annual. And I served audience or group of people who came to see the show with a packed lunch, with a set of photographs, like a lecture. And that was, it was a packed lunch, essentially, a sort of savoury and sweet sort of little packed meal, but it was packed full of meaning. And then from then on, it was about quite often feeding people or drawing with food, or as in drawing a month's experience, or I think the only show I've done that's completely without food was Pull Yourself Together, and I was really, really happy about that. But everything else, it always seems to come back in. I don't know, it's just a very useful language sometimes to use. Sorry, I'm going on at great length. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, you absolutely have, and it does make complete sense, and it contextually just it just fits throughout your work and the themes that you cover. When you're talking about female lives and domesticity over the last 4 decades, food is unequivocally, a huge part of that, and the way that you considered your work like Packed Lunch, or work that can disappear, the ephemeral nature of it. And there's a lot of, according to my lecturer friend from Goldsmiths, Louise Ashcroft, who's a performance artist herself, she said that she knew that I was speaking to you, and she wanted me to say that you have been a huge influence on her and so many of young artists coming through now.
Oh, I'm so pleased, because I do hear that, but I don't think as an older woman artist you get... Well, can I just answer what I've come to realise about this? Because I'm so proud of that, to be an influence as sort of to have opened up a subject or to started something or whatever. But what really astonished me was a few years ago, I began... Yeah, that's right. I'll have to give you an example. So this great filmmaker called William Rabin was commissioned to make a film by Acme Studios, and it's called Acme 72 to 82. And it was the first 10 years of Acme Studios. And I was one of the early artists to get an Acme studio. It was the very first, I think, artists studio association where they took over Short Life Property, and I think they started in East London. I don't think there was anybody else doing it when they started that in 72. And I got a prefab in Stepney in 74, and I lived there for a while, and it was that's when I did An Edible Family in a Mobile Home in 1976, when I turned that whole prefab into a sort of sugar. Every wall was newsprint and then covered with sugar, floor, ceiling, walls, curtains, everything. And then there was a life-size family made out of food, apart from the mother, who was a sort of portable serving hatch kitchen type thing with a teapot for a head. But the people came and ate the family throughout the week. And anyway, this film, Bill Rabin came and interviewed me, and I've got these amazing quality. My ex-husband, Andrew Whittock, who I still work with on good terms, he's a wonderful photographer, and I met him in 74, and he started documenting my work right from the beginning. So I've got a credible sort of backlog of, a catalogue of photographs that he's taken of pretty well everything I've done. And so I had these incredible photographs, and Bill interviewed me. But the way he put it into that film, it's almost like it's a film. You feel like it's very clever. So there was a screening at the Hackney Picture House of this film, and I went to it. And I've had this huge amount of physical things. I've got arthritis, so I sort of hobble around. And because I've had 12 operations since 2003 for breast cancer and this, that, and the other, I've sort of been quite out of it. And before that was mentally ill. So I was sort of out of it for a reason first time. So, being in a really good state, even though needing another knee replacement, it was just so exciting to go to this thing at Hackney Picture House, to see something that I was really proud to be part of. And being a film about that era, there were very few of us women artists who were featured, but it was like the art world was there that I don't usually get a chance to mix with. I felt like I'd finally arrived, in this sort of, Tate type sort of environment. And some of my peers, artists I knew who went to art school, but they were much more well-known male artists. And I sort of sat there with my ears going red, thinking they're all seeing this and I'm so proud. And then afterwards there was this wine, and I made myself stand there, I had a glass of wine, and this guy who'd been an Acme artist came up to me and he said, "Oh, it's so good to see your work, Bobby. You are so funny, Bobby. You make us laugh so much." And just, ha, 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 ha. You're so funny, Bobby. It was very hard to restrain myself not to throw the wine in his face. And it was an absolute moment of seeing how he needed to patronize me, and how that was still, despite being well known, there was this undercurrent of you're not, and this is what came out in the show in Madrid with this young Spanish curator, that what I've done is breaking so many taboos. It's about the grot and its cake. It could be, it's so easy to dismiss it if you're threatened by the message behind it, and it's funny. And so there's a whole package that is just, it's too female. And so we laugh at you and we laugh about you. And then I was so cross and began to look around and realize I'd only ever been commissioned by women. That really took me aback. I didn't ever realize that. Apart from one wonderful exception of this guy who had the idea and the diary drawings. But he was the only man. And I know there's a lot of men who support my work, and then I kind of went through quite a painful process of not wanting to feel moany or complaining, but then starting to look around at people I went to art school and think, no, I'm not, there isn't parity. And it's because of that. And so being much more determined to defy that, to kind of challenge it. And a few years on, I feel it's beginning to happen, really, that to resist this sort of buttonholing, this kind of to do with the predominant culture, to challenge it. And in a way, it's something I've never been good at. It's sort of networking. But I found Women of the World Festival and Jude Kelly and that whole network beyond encouraging, because that's what it's about. That is really what that whole thing is about, is changing the way you think about yourself and changing the way the world thinks and the whatever. Yeah. God, I'm talking at great length, but it's so nice to be able to talk about it.
Another thing that Amy said when she was talking about the performance, but your work in general, is that she loves and is really interested in the idea of the disruptive domesticity and the subversive behaviour. But for me, added to that is the fact that you use that disruptive domestic side to also totally disrupt and subversively not attack, that's too strong a word, but consider and reflect the art world. As well.
I thank you, because I just adore the visual arts, particularly. But I like lots of things, but I love painting. It's what I grew up so passionate about, and I love a lot of the work that's going on. But it's what I felt at St Martin's. It is elitist. It is, that's how it operates, and it's partly because it's commerce and whatever. But it is, you always have to dress in a certain way to be accepted, and I think that's really changing. But it's well, I'm always an optimist. But, when you think of Lubena Himid winning the Turner Prize, I nearly wept with excitement. I just was like, finally. I mean, Grayson Perry winning was a breakthrough. It's like this is beginning to change, and they're kind of very aware that it needs to be challenged what it is. But so if I talk about disrupting the domestic, the issue is, if you think about, this issue of the domestic, it is so profoundly the narrative, as it is about mental illness or anything. It's kind of set by psychiatry. That is what is the perceived understanding, that somebody is ill and disordered, or the perceived narrative is that everyday life, even the words to do with domestic work are housework, drudgery and chores, that there aren't words that sort of celebrate it to describe. Oh, it's so interesting if you think in Norway there are very, very many different words for the sea, as in, there are different words in Eskimo culture, Inuit culture for snow. In our language about domesticity, there's drudgery and chores in English. I've searched and searched for more words, but very few. They're derogatory and negative. So if you talk about that directly, you just play into that, or you are then categorizable as somebody who's, so you've got to subvert it. You've got to twist it. You've got to surprise people or shock people, like taking a piss out of yourself, or you've got to kind of twist it. And so it's kind of Dada, I suppose. You've got to use these edge things that shock people, and humor is a very good way. I mean, when I was young, I did this 1 year teacher certificate at Goldsmiths, and actually the whole time I was just making performances. They were so good to me. They let me, my dissertation was a performance. I don't know why they let me get away with it. And teaching is not my strong. I never aspired to be a teacher, really. I just wanted to do the course, and it was, And so that's when I really discovered, when I talk about these things I made out of sugar and cake, that everybody laughed, and said, your work's so funny. You are so funny. And this was the work that I kept submitting again and again to the Royal College and kept getting turned down by. And I was so mortified, because I thought it was life-changing. I thought it was really radical and really, really, and so that people saw it as funny. And then I thought, actually, I don't care, and then I began to realize that it was a really powerful, wit was a really powerful way of people kind of coming to a subject in a different way, and using strange images and strange connections was really sort of a powerful way of getting people to think about things differently. Yeah, that's it. So I think that's why, and making fun of the received norm. I'm so naive. I kind of find things very funny, and I got invited, because my work's quite odd, I suppose, and performative. I get invited onto these television programs. I remember being on This Morning up in Liverpool, and I just thought it was hysterically funny, which it was. And Rosie Millard, who was the sort of quite young person working on the programme at the time, told me years later when I next met her that there'd been a huge row at the end because I had made fun of the resident cook. I didn't do it. I danced around behind her wearing a pair of baked antlers. I mean, which was about improving my status. And it was funny and people watched it. But of course, it was mocking home economy to a degree. So, and because I didn't mean her any harm, I was never realised why I was never asked back to anything like that because I was on the Gary Rhodes programme and they had to completely reshoot it because I could see the whole crew were just quaking with laughter as I kind of, so I think it's just a way of being. I think my family is like that. You sort of take the piss out of things, and particularly the women, you laugh about things. And so it's not just being funny,
really powerful.
It's about coming up with really odd ideas that people can't help but relate to. And it doesn't always work.
So I don't make work similar to yours, but I have a similar ethos, I suppose, that I often deal with issues that might be a bit dark or, can be quite gloomy or, but I don't want to talk about them in that way. So I like to consider the visuals as quite ridiculous, because it makes it more relatable and it opens it up a bit. And I rewatched your kitchen show, the Older Work, earlier today. And I sat watching it, and it's that you are being subversive there in the action of what you're doing and the joy that you are describing from this really mundane routine action. It's talking about that mundane domesticity and the politics around it, but it also is quite poignant and looking at the poetry of actually you can find joy in those things. As you're saying, you're talking about there aren't any positive words about domestic life, but you can find little bits of joy in there.
You can find lots of it. Like everybody who does routine things like, peeling carrots. I just cannot fail to be delighted by a lot of things like that. And I think a lot of us feel like that. But, so yes, I see it. I see what you mean.
Yeah. Talking about kitchen show, and it made me think about the poetic and nostalgic ideas of daily life. And then I know within your I'm not sure where it fit within your chronology of work, but you began Daily Life Limited, which was the organisation, again, almost ridiculing the corporate structure. Is that right? But it's an arts organisation.
Well, it's about daily life. It actually is limited because it's, you can't do everything about daily life. So it's definitely going to be limited. But it's got the LTD with a dot because it's like being a company. I think a lot of thanks for picking up on that because a lot of things get missed, like the Daily Life series, which was a domestic quintet, which I thought was really clever a response to all the incredibly macho trilogies that were being produced, or, these kind of great so-and-so was doing this trilogy, and it was quite kind of big and got an awful lot of funding. And so I was going to do a domestic quintet and nobody really noticed. When I realized quite early on that I needed to make a decision about what I was going to wear when I was performing, if I was going to be performing. And the real hero at that time was Boyce, Joseph Boyce, and his fishing jacket, or whatever you call it, waistcoat, and his hat. And I thought, oh, well, I'm going to do my own version, which will be an overall, woman's overall, but it was definitely in response to that and slightly taking the piss out of it, if I'm just being a bit blunt. But I just wonder how much people have noticed. But quite often it's like, oh, God, you're going to do that and I'm going to do this. But it's also quite convenient. So, there's a bit of, I hate the word irreverence, but it's a mixture of things, because it's also a really interesting image, say, an overall, or it's a really interesting, what was the other thing I was talking about? There are many ways of looking at them, really.
Yeah. Well, I think the uniform side of things, that struck me when I was looking at your work when I was in the Larder study room last year. I really loved your use of uniform of the white overall, which again just is so perfect contextually. But also when you I can't remember the name of the work, but the work where you are also, you're almost interviewing yourself as this is what a psychiatrist looks like. This is what a psychiatrist would wear.
Yeah.
Okay. And I love that work. Yeah.
Well, that was because I was so pissed off having been in the mental health system, all these experts, and actually some of them, the psychologists, are really clever, but I don't have a lot to say positive about the psychiatric profession. Although there's very individual great psychiatrists, the actual profession is deeply flawed in my opinion, as is, I wouldn't go on about that, but, so I decided that all of these people though, because they are so kind of, they've got to earn a living and they've got to make a stand for it. And if you look at the history of psychiatry versus psychology versus psychotherapy versus psychoanalysis, is fascinating, to do with economy and power and whatever, and how it's linked sometimes to the pharmaceutical profession. But I just thought, well, you all experts telling me and us how to live, I'm going to invent my own therapy, and I'll have a therapy empire, which I thought was really funny. But it was rather kind of almost backfired, because if you're going to launch a therapy empire, you've got to do it on a really big platform like the Barbican main stage. And somehow one thing led to another, and it was there, but it was such a massively ambitious show. And I really wasn't very well at the time, but it worked, but God, I mean, it was a lot of effort for everybody. But I had to wear that overall, but I also had to have the right shoes. So part of it was to describe how the shoes were. And it sort of summed up. I met a psychoanalyst too. I've got quite friendly with dog walking, and I didn't like to tell him what I did, and I did it. I thought, actually, you are like the shoes. You are like the psychoanalyst shoes, that's who you are, but I will not tell him that.
So, you've touched a couple of times on the fact that you had a breakdown, and I think one of the really positive things, I see it as positive things to come out of that was this amazing diary of drawings that you did. I'd love to hear about that. And Amy was really keen as well, because she was part of the founding group last year of something called Maternal Journal.
No, I've found that. It's great. Yeah. And
Laura Godfrey Isaacs is the artist who set that up, and they're essentially promoting journaling for good mental health during pregnancy and afterwards.
I've great admired Laura.
So Amy was really, I am as well, really interested in your thoughts on journaling as a feminist practice, your own personal journey of using a diary, how it was for you.
Well, really, I never really thought about it before. My mental health had been very ropey for over 2 or 3 years, and I was kind of flailing around really. So I referred myself to this day centre in Clerkenwell, which was still operating then. It was a therapeutic community. You just refer yourself. And this psychiatrist had told me I had a personality disorder, which I thought was so outrageously rude. It's like, how dare you? Well, I got on quite well with him, but I said, I beg your pardon, there's nothing wrong with my personality. And so I went off to this place, which was pretty anarchic, and perfect in many respects. I mean, it was just too much group therapy, but I met a wonderful bunch of people, and I sort of went there on and off for a while. But I was pretty horrified to be there, and I was just going to be there for 3 weeks in January 97 it was. And it had an art room, and it's now the Michael Palin Centre for Stammering. I think it's a kind of health building in Clerkenwell, and had this sort of room downside that nobody used regularly. So I thought, well, I'm not really here. I've always wanted to do watercolour painting. So I kind of, on the first day, arrived with these paints and this book that I wanted to do some paintings in. And I decided to do a drawing a day. And that was the beginning of it. And so it wasn't a journal, it was a survival. And a kind of way of denying what was going on. But then it came absolutely a lifeline. And when I was there, the first bit I had to do, the rule was I had to do a drawing every day that I was there, which became quite a weight. So then I changed the rules that I had to do a drawing a week. And I kind of kept it up for 11 years. And I think that the reason I did that was because almost like it became more and more of a telling of the story. But also, at certain stages, the only thing that kept me going, was I had to do this drawing. It was interesting. And of course, I did so many drawings, there were over 700. And they were initially secret, but then I started showing them to my psychologist, rather brilliant psychologist. And he just fell on this photocopy and said, oh, can I use that in training? Because I know a lot of people who feel like you. And I had no idea that I'd drawn the inside of my head as being, monstrously evil, myself as a sort of hidden monster. And I said, what do you mean other people feel like this? And he went, oh, God, yeah, you all do. And it was such an incredible help to think it wasn't just me. So it became a communication. And then ultimately this wonderful guy in Daniel Hinchcliffe in Bath University said, have you got anything for Mental Health Week? And I said, no, I've only got these drawings and I can't show them. But he said, could Andrew photograph them and make them into prints? And so that's how and then ultimately, because that small exhibition toured a bit, I approached the Wellcome to do a whole, the whole thing. Because by then I was well. I'd nearly finished them and I wanted to tell the whole story. And I curated it with my daughter, who was by then trainee psychologist. So we kind of chose about 150 of them. But that thing, what was rather sad was that it was such a joy in many ways to do it. And so, because I didn't ever think I had to show anybody any of them. So I was just entirely doing them to make sense of all these different things. But then this great friend, I said, oh, I don't know what to do about now because it's the end of that story. And she said, well, you don't have to keep going. And it was a great relief to stop, actually, because the reaction to the diary drawings, the exhibition and then the book was pretty overwhelming. It took a while to absorb being that public. And I'm still dealing with the aftershock of that people don't think you can ever get better. They don't think you can move through and beyond that, which I so massively have. And so I found it quite difficult. I haven't been able to do it since in that way. I haven't kept any regular drawings since then. And I don't know that I ever will because it's so much that's what it was. But I paint and draw, but my current things I'm working on is I'm doing making propaganda posters about my domestic revolutionary party.
I've seen this epic domestic. This sounds fantastic. Tell us about it.
I mean, it's really sort of got a small commission to do a poster for Madrid, and it got such interest in a wall painting. And so I'm working on some more propaganda posters. I love the idea that all it can be is the propaganda. Although there will be these revolutionary Dadaistic acts of me in the street. I want to turn up in important pompous places and do very strange dances wearing very odd outfits. But it hopefully will be a lot more than that. So we're applying for some money to do a kind of digital campaign as well. So it's about propaganda and it's about the notion, but that really has to be subversive and it really has to be edgy. Otherwise, it's going to get dismissed. It's got to have many twists in it to make people see what it's about, if you see what I mean. So that's what I'm up to at the moment.
I think you're the right person to do that. I mean, I've had a lot of your time tonight, but the recent work that you've done really just encompasses all that you know, the type of work that you do, the way that you reach audiences and create work that is interactive, in whether it's sculptural food, whether it's performative, it's all interactive, like the Roving Diagnostic Unit or Great and Tiny War in Newcastle, the amazing house that you filled with your work, you know, lasting pieces and on-off pieces. It's just that type, the work that you create is so relevant still and so current.
So I'm excited. One thing I really want to say is my work's very collaborative, so I don't make it all on my own. I mean, with Edible Family in the Mobile Home, I did make it on my own, and I kind of moved on from that. It's so great if you work with, you know, great teams of people who bring different things, or just one person for a period of time, like Baloch Brown. You know, that there's a strength in this collaborative process, and that's what I will carry on doing more. You know, it's not that kind of narrative that you just get this one kind of master painter or master artist, because that's always been a bit of a myth, really. Well, it's not entirely for some people, but do you know what I mean? I think if you're going to do very complicated sets of ideas, you have to challenge that notion of...
Yeah, and I think relevant that as feminist artists we are working collaboratively and we're honest about it, and that it does break down that patriarchal idea of what an artist is.
Leadership. It's a notion of leadership. I mean, I am, you know, artistic director of things, but it doesn't mean I could do it all. And you know, by having the right team of people, like in Newcastle, you get more than the sum of its parts, you know, because we all bring something. And it's a pretty joyful process in that way. I couldn't have done the Diary Drawing collection without Andrew, or Dora, actually. So, yeah, I'm a great believer in being straightforward about that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Bobby. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
I really enjoyed it. I hope all the breaking up and the tech problems didn't nobble it too much, but I've been wandering around my kitchen dealing with a rather annoying dog who wants to get out through the cat flap and bark at a fox.
Thank you for listening. This was Woman Up, the podcast series by Desperate Art Wives.